A tracking dog's nose contains approximately 300 million olfactory receptors. A human nose contains around 6 million. This difference is not simply quantitative. It produces a qualitatively different experience of the world. A dog moving through landscape is moving through a world that is primarily chemical, a world of scent trails and scent pools and scent gradients that persist in the environment for hours or days, or in some conditions, weeks after the source has passed. The dog is reading a record that the human investigators around it cannot perceive. When the handler watches the dog work, they are watching a translation, an animal moving through information that exists below the threshold of human sense and making that information visible through behavior. This is why tracking dogs are among the most reliable tools in search and rescue. Not infallible. Scent degrades under specific conditions. Wind patterns complicate direction. Water disperses trails in ways that require skilled interpretation. But within their operational parameters, well-trained tracking dogs find things. They find things that human searchers miss. They find things that technology misses. They are sensitive to a dimension of the physical world that most of our instruments are not designed to access, which makes the documented pattern of tracking dogs stopping at specific terrain features and refusing to continue past those features. One of the more significant anomalies in the missing 411 research. Because these dogs are not stopping because they've lost the trail. They stop when the trail is clearest. They stop when they know exactly where it goes, and they will not go there. This episode takes the pattern that appeared in individual cases across the first arc of this series and examines it as what it has become through accumulation. Not an anomaly in several unrelated cases, but a consistent documented phenomenon with a geographic distribution that suggests something specific about the terrain in which it occurs. The map that emerges when you mark the locations where tracking dogs have refused is not a random distribution. It has a shape. The data for this analysis comes from multiple sources, none of them official. There is no federal database of unusual tracking dog behavior in SAR cases. There is no research program systematically studying the phenomenon. The information exists in the personal notes of handlers, in the informal conversations of SAR coordinators, in the kind of professional knowledge that circulates within communities of practice without ever making it into formal documentation. Paulides identified the pattern in his case research and has documented it across numerous disappearance cases. Several independent SAR researchers have noted it in regional studies of specific wilderness areas, and the handlers themselves, the men and women who have spent careers working dogs in wilderness terrain and who understand the behavioral vocabulary of their animals at a level that no outsider can fully access, have been comparing notes informally for years. What those notes, assembled and examined together, show is this. The locations where tracking dogs refuse are not randomly distributed across wilderness terrain. They concentrate in specific elevation bands, in specific geological formations, in specific configurations of terrain where the relationship between rock and water and drainage produces a specific kind of environment. The boulder fields that appear repeatedly in this series, the areas adjacent to specific water convergence zones, the terrain at the transition between dense forest and exposed subalpine, the specific sections of trail that appear in hindsight, after the pattern has been identified, to occupy particular kinds of positions in the larger geography of their landscapes. These are, as readers of this series will recognize, the same terrain features that appear in the broader pattern of disappearance cluster geography. The same elevation bands, the same geological signatures, the same relationship between rock formation type and drainage pattern. The dogs are stopping in the places where the other anomalies concentrate. This is not a coincidence, or if it is a coincidence, it is one that requires explanation. The handler who has perhaps thought most carefully about this phenomenon is a woman who spent 26 years working tracking dogs for SAR operations in the Pacific Northwest. She is not a theorist. She describes herself as a practitioner, someone whose knowledge lives in the field, in the specific relationship between her and her animals, in the accumulated experience of thousands of hours of actual search work. She is suspicious of frameworks that come before evidence and trusts frameworks that emerge from it. She came to her views about the dog refusal phenomenon the way she came to most of her views, by seeing it happen repeatedly and following the observation wherever it led. She first encountered what she would later identify as a refusal, as distinct from a lost trail, in the third year of her career. She was working a case in the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, a disappearance that had produced none of the physical evidence that should have been present after 2 days of search. Her dog picked up the scent at the trailhead and held it cleanly for almost a mile before stopping at the edge of a boulder field that edged the trail. She described the stop as unmistakable, not the body language of uncertainty or lost scent. She knew that body language well. Her dog had moved to the edge of the boulder field, stopped, looked at her once, looked at the boulders, and sat down, facing them with her ears slightly forward and her body in the specific posture of attentive stillness. She reset the dog, came back to the same point from a different direction, got the same stop. She noted it as unusual. She told her partner, who shrugged and said, "Dogs sometimes do that." She found the missing hiker by other means 2 days later, in terrain on the far side of the boulder field, in terrain that had already been searched. She filed the behavior in the back of her mind and continued working. Over the next 23 years, she encountered it 17 more times. 17 documented refusals. Different cases, different terrain, different dogs, the same behavior, the same posture, the same quality of communication. By year 10, she was mapping them. The map she had assembled by the time she spoke with the researcher covered 15 years of personal experience and had been supplemented by accounts from 6 other handlers she trusted enough to compare notes with. Together, across the 7 handlers' combined experience, they had documented 41 refusals in the Pacific Northwest alone. She laid out the map on the table between her and the researcher. The refusal locations formed a pattern that she described in the specific language of someone who had spent a long time looking at it. They cluster around the same kinds of places, not identical. They're spread across a wide area, different drainages, different elevations, but the same kinds of places. Boulder fields, areas where 2 drainages meet, the edges of specific geological formations, places where the terrain changes character, where one kind of rock transitions to another kind, where the vegetation shifts in ways that reflect what's happening underground. She said, When I started seeing it as a pattern, I started asking the other handlers I knew about it. Not in a leading way, I just asked if they'd ever seen a dog refuse a trail it was clearly tracking, if they'd seen the behavior I was describing. She said, most of them had. She said, and when I asked them where and mapped those locations, they fell into the same kinds of places as the ones on my map. The researcher asked how many locations total across the 7 handlers. She said, 41 documented. Probably more that weren't noted specifically enough to be useful. The researcher asked, what do you make of it? She was quiet for a moment. She had the specific quality of quiet that comes from having thought about something for a long time and having arrived at a position that is honest about its own limits. She said, I've thought about it from every angle I can reach. I've talked to veterinarians about olfactory processing in dogs under stress. I've talked to geologists about what specific rock formations produce in terms of electromagnetic fields and gas emissions. I've read everything I can find on localized atmospheric phenomena in mountain terrain. She said, I have partial explanations for some of the refusals. Some of them are probably gas emissions from specific geological formations. There are rock types that outgas compounds that dogs find aversive. Some of them are probably electromagnetic. Dogs are sensitive to electromagnetic fields in ways that humans aren't, and there are areas of geological complexity that produce unusual fields. She said, those explanations account for some of it, not all of it. She said, the cases where the trail is clearest, where the dog is clearly following a strong, fresh scent trail and stops mid-trail with no loss of scent, those are the ones I can't account for. She said, a dog that has lost a scent searches for it. A dog that has encountered an aversive stimulus backs away from it. What I'm describing is neither of those. It's a dog that has followed a trail to a specific point and decided to communicate something about what that point represents. She said, I've watched dogs do this 18 times, and every time what I've read in their body language is not confusion and not aversion. It's a kind of clarity, like they understand something I don't, and they're telling me about it as clearly as they can. She said, I don't know what they understand, but I've stopped assuming it's nothing. The geographic distribution of the refusal locations across the Pacific Northwest map overlaps significantly with the distribution of disappearance cases in the same region. This is the observation that the handler found most difficult to sit with. Not because it surprised her. By the time she was assembling the map, she had already formed a general hypothesis about the relationship between the refusal locations and the disappearance pattern. What was difficult was the specific quality of the overlap. She had not expected the alignment to be as precise as it was. Not every disappearance case in the map overlapped with a known refusal location. Not every refusal location was associated with a disappearance case. The overlap was partial, as it should be if the phenomenon is real, but not universal. If specific terrain features in specific configurations produce specific effects under specific conditions, you would expect the distribution to be clustered but not complete. What she found was clustered and consistent across the larger pattern that the full set of cases produced. The places where the dogs stop are not randomly distributed relative to the places where people go missing. They are associated, in the specific statistical sense, of appearing together more often than they would if the distributions were independent. This, she said, was the thing she could not find a conventional explanation for. Not the refusals themselves. Those had partial explanations in geological and electromagnetic phenomena, as she had noted. But the association between the refusals and the disappearances. She said, the simplest explanation for the association is that the dogs and the missing people are responding to the same thing. That the same feature of the terrain that makes the dogs stop is the same feature that's involved in what happens to people who go missing there. She said, I don't know what that feature is, but it's the hypothesis that fits the data best. She said, I've sat with that hypothesis for a long time. I'm still not sure what to do with it. There is a working geologist who has spent years studying the specific rock formations that appear in the refusal location map. She was brought to the research by the handler herself, who approached her through a mutual contact with the specific request that she look at the geological data without being told the full context, without being told that what she was examining were locations associated with unusual dog behavior and disappearance cases. The geologist agreed to this. She reviewed the geological data for the mapped locations and provided an analysis. Her findings were specific and technically detailed, but their summary is this. The refusal locations share a set of geological characteristics at a rate that is higher than the surrounding terrain would predict. These characteristics include proximity to fault lines and geological boundaries, elevated concentrations of specific mineral types with known electromagnetic properties, complex underground hydrology, and terrain configurations that produce unusual microclimate effects. None of these characteristics are individually unusual in the Pacific Northwest, which is a geologically complex region. What is unusual is their co-occurrence, the specific combination of features appearing together at the refusal locations at a higher rate than the regional baseline. When the geologist was told the full context of what she had been analyzing, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That's interesting." The researcher asked what she meant. She said, "The combination of features I identified is associated in other research contexts with elevated electromagnetic field complexity, with the specific kind of microenvironmental variability that makes certain areas behave differently from their surroundings in ways that sensitive instruments and some biological systems can detect." She said, "I've been aware of the Devereux research on Earthlights and the Persinger work on electromagnetic effects on biological systems. I've been skeptical of the interpretive frameworks around that research, but the geological signature I identified in your map is the signature that those researchers associate with the highest activity locations in their own documentation." She said, "I don't know what to do with that coincidence." She said, "I'm going to sit with it for a while." The handler who spent 26 years mapping the refusals is still active in SAR, though less frequently now. She continues to work dogs. She continues to note the refusals when they occur and to add them to her map. She said, "I've shared the map with 3 SAR coordinators in the region. 2 of them looked at it, nodded and said something like, 'Yes, that matches what I've observed.' Neither of them asked to discuss it further." She said, "The third one said she wanted a copy. She's been adding to it from her own records." She said, "We haven't formed any official research group. We haven't published anything. We're not in a position to do that, and I'm not sure we'd want to even if we were. What we're doing is more like maintaining a record, keeping a careful note of the things that the official record doesn't have space for. She said, in the hope that eventually someone who knows what to do with it will come along. The researcher said, what would you want them to do with it? She said, I want them to look at the terrain, not the cases, the terrain. I want someone to go to the specific locations with the right instruments and the right expertise and really look at what's there, at what these places have in common physically, at what the geology and the hydrology and the electromagnetic environment are doing in these specific configurations. She said, because I think the answer to what the dogs are responding to is in the terrain. It's a physical feature. I'm convinced of that. I'm just not convinced yet that it's a physical feature we have good instruments for. She said, the dogs have instruments for it. That's what they've been telling us. She said, for a very long time, and we haven't been listening. There is a specific case from the Oregon cluster area that the handler included in her map. In September 2008, a search was underway for a missing deer hunter in the interior terrain of southern Oregon. His truck was at the trailhead. The search began the following morning. The handler, working the primary canine track, had been brought in from a county to the north. She did not know the history of the area. She was given only the standard case briefing. Her dog picked up the trail immediately, moved with focused urgency through the lower forest, across the first drainage, up toward the older timber. At the edge of the older forest, the specific section the Forest Service biologist had described in episode 6 as the area where animal behavior was sometimes unusual. The dog stopped, not gradually, immediately, as if a door had closed. The handler reset. Different approach, same stop, same location. She wrote in her field log, dog stopped at the boundary of the old growth section. Clear trail to that point. No indication of scent loss. Refusal behavior. She had never worked this terrain before. She had no knowledge of previous cases in the area. She had no knowledge of the biologist's observations. She had no knowledge that this specific boundary had any documented significance. She just noted what her dog told her. The missing hunter was found 4 days later, alive, in terrain on the far side of the old growth section. He had no memory of crossing through it. His recovery location was in an area that had been searched on day 2. When the search coordinator, who had worked the Oregon cluster for years, reviewed the case file and saw the refusal note, she said to a colleague, it was the same spot, not approximately, not nearby, the same spot where dogs had stopped twice before, in 2 other cases, in other years. She said, I marked it on my own map. She said, there are 7 others. The map continues to grow. Each year, in the quiet conversations that happen at the edges of SAR community gatherings and in the private messages that handlers and coordinators exchange with people they trust, new data points are added, new cases, new locations, new instances of the same behavior in the same kinds of places. The shape of the distribution is becoming clearer. It is not random. It has a character. It has a geography. And it overlaps with a precision that cannot be explained by coincidence. With the geography of cases that this series has been examining since its first episode. The dogs are not simply reacting to something aversive. They are responding to something specific, something that exists in specific terrain features, in specific configurations, at specific elevations, and that has been sending people into places they cannot account for longer than the tracking dogs have been recording the stops. The investigation continues into the map, into the terrain that the map describes, into what is there that the dogs know about, and that the rest of us are still learning to see. The next episode in this series takes the geographic pattern one step further. Not the dogs, not the weather, not the elevation and the berries, the recovery locations, the specific places where people are found after disappearances that should not have produced those locations, the places that were already searched, the terrain that investigators covered before the subject was found there, the geography of the impossible. A search theory analyst who has spent 15 years studying the mathematics of recovery probability in wilderness. Disappearances has identified something in the data that he describes carefully as a systematic deviation from what the models predict. Not small deviations, not the noise that accumulates around any probabilistic model. Systematic deviations in specific terrain types, in specific clusters. The models say the person should be here, the person is found there, and there has something in common with the other theirs, in other cases, in other states, in other decades. The map the handler drew from dog refusal data and the map that emerges from recovery location anomalies are not the same map, but they overlap in ways that the investigation continues to examine, with the patience that questions like this require, and with the growing sense that the map being assembled from all of these separate observations is the map of something real, something that the terrain holds, and that the people who go into it sometimes encounter, and sometimes do not come back from the same.